I have a short bio here for Meryl Nass. I'll just read it through. Meryl Nass is an internal medicine physician and was the first person in the world to prove that an epidemic, the anthrax situation in Rhodesia, was due to biological warfare in 1992. She has given 6 congressional testimonies regarding anthrax, biological warfare, Gulf War syndrome, the vaccine, and vaccine safety, and has consulted with the Cuban Ministry of Health, the World Bank, and the Director of National Intelligence. Since the COVID pandemic began, she has written detailed articles regarding the suppression of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin for treatment of COVID, the cover-up of COVID's lab origin, and how the WHO's proposed pandemic treaty and amendments will lead to more pandemics. She's an advisor to the Children's Health Defense. Her medical license was suspended in January 2022 for providing early COVID treatment and spreading alleged vaccine misinformation. She's been writing and speaking on all things COVID and is now focused on the biosecurity agenda of the WHO and its goal to wrest sovereignty from individual nations under the guise of pandemic preparedness. So thank you, Meryl, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? Good. Thanks very much. I wanted to say just a couple of words about Graeme. Graeme was someone I knew for a number of years, although I'm not sure we've ever met in person. He had invited me to speak a couple of times. We both were very interested in the origin of the anthrax and the anthrax letters. I'm sure both of us were very disappointed that we still haven't gotten to the bottom of that. And Graeme did me a very important favor before he died. Back in early 2021, he got an invitation to attend a Zoom with a lot of scientists and doctors around the world, and he wasn't able to do it, but he asked me if I wanted to attend. And that really is what started my linkages with particularly in Europe, but in other continents as well, groups of scientists and doctors, and that those connections have stood me in very good stead while I've investigated COVID some more. So I'm very appreciative to Graeme for thinking of me and for what a fine, wonderful human being he was. All right, so I'm going to try to go historically very quickly and give you a sense of what biological warfare is, and that it isn't something, theoretical. It really happens. It probably happens a whole lot more than we know, and it's about to, hit us in the head with more and more pandemics unless we do something about it. So I've taken a page from the United Nations to try to explain what are biological weapons. Well, they're any microorganism that is living that can reproduce, or the products of microorganisms like toxins, or they might have started out as microorganisms, but with gain-of-function research, they've been made even more pathogenic, virulent, or more transmissible, or both. And so that's what they are. Normal bacteria, viruses, fungi can be biological weapons if they're put in a weapon, if they're deliberately spread. Doesn't have to be any difference between the normal disease and an offensive act of war. And that's why using biological weapons can be very desirable for a nation or a subnational group, because they can be made to seem as if they're natural occurrences, unlike chemical and nuclear weapons, where you can't do that. This is the first well-documented next slide, episode of biological warfare, which happened in Crimea in 1346, when the Mongols were attacking the Genoans, who had a walled city, and the attack lasted over a year, and they still couldn't win, and they started hurling dead bodies over the walls of the city with a catapult device. And this caused the Black Death plague, and the Genoans got in their boats, went back to Europe, and spread the Black Plague to Europe. Next slide. Here, we all know the British gave smallpox-infested blankets to the Indians when the British were fighting in the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Unit 731 is a book about a massive Japanese program of biological warfare, which did human research studies on unwitting humans. And these weapons were used for sure in China during World War II and possibly before, killing estimated 100,000 or more Chinese. Next slide. It wasn't only the Japanese, but the United States had a well-developed biological warfare program during World War II also. This book was published in 1947 by actually the deceased husband of a woman who became my friend. He had worked in the program against the Nazis, and when the war was over, said we need to stop this program and shut it down. And the U.S. government said, no way, we like this. And so he left and published a monograph about exactly what the U.S. had been doing during the war and the agents against humans, plants, and animals. In other words, food crops and food livestock. And this picture on the right is a device that was used to test experimental animals. And force them to breathe in pathogens. Next slide. So 25 years after the end of the war, Nixon announced he was going to end biological warfare in the U.S. and around the world. And the United States would work with the British to create a treaty that would ban all biological warfare going forward. However, the United States reserved the right to do defensive research, such as research that could lead to vaccines. And we were supposed to get rid of all of our biological weapons, but it turned out later that did not quite happen. So the Biological Weapons Convention was developed. It was finalized in 1972, went out for signatures, and it went into force in 1975. However, initially it had no provisions for doing investigations in countries of allegations of possible use or possible development of biological warfare agents, and there were no punishments. These were to be figured out later, and so every 5 years, a review conference has been held ever since then to try to strengthen this treaty and make it actually, workable, enforceable, and so that it could stop the use of biological weapons agents. Unfortunately, the U.S. has been the major country blocking the development of more stringent ways of dealing with biological warfare. In 2004, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution against the proliferation, use, development, acquisition, etc., transport of both nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And this was particularly an attempt to prevent proliferation of these weapons. So the Biological Weapons Convention is signed and ratified by the United States, and this UN Security Council resolution also applies to the United States and to the rest of the world. However, while the United States was negotiating the Biological Weapons Convention, it used African swine fever on Cuban pigs. And this led to a required culling of 500,000 pigs. Virtually every pig in Cuba, which was their main source of meat, had to be killed because of this infection. There were whistleblowers who explained how the CIA had provided the virus, how it went to Panama, and then eventually to Cuba. I knew that the Washington Post had published an article about this, as did the San Francisco Chronicle and Newsday, and it was really hard to find the Washington Post article. But here it is, and then I discovered above that this was actually a CIA sanitized version of this story, which was reported in 1977. In 1981, Cuba was suffering from the second very severe dengue virus attack with a different strain. There are 4 strains of dengue. And they had a different strain the second time, and hundreds of thousands of people were affected by it. It's a painful viral illness that lasts a few weeks. It's called breakbone fever, and it kills babies and young children and killed 113 Cubans. And it had not been present in the Western Hemisphere previously. And Castro was suspicious that this may have been a biological warfare attack as well, particularly when they had suffered the African swine fever, sugarcane rust, blue mold on tobacco, and some other potential biological warfare episodes, all of which the U.S. they were suspicious that the U.S. may have caused. I remember when I was a consultant in Cuba, I was told that I was a consultant for this epidemic in 1993, and I was told that planes registered to the State Department had flown over Cuba shortly before they had outbreaks of these various diseases in their food crops. This was a peculiar new syndrome that affected 50,000 people in Cuba and turned out to be due to cyanide, which was probably in the water or the food. I also, and this is what I investigated on my own. When I was in Cuba, there were many people investigating that epidemic, and I was one of several who came up with the source being cyanide, combined with nutritional deficiencies that were going on in Cuba at the time. But this, I was the first person in the world to take any epidemic and show that it was due to biological warfare. And in this case, it occurrhed during Rhodesia's civil war, which was also a race war between 1978 and 1980, again, when the Biological Weapons Convention was in force, although without enforceable provisions. The Russians were also breaking the rules. There was an accidental leak at an anthrax factory in Sverdlovsk, which was a partially closed city, so there were very few foreigners allowed to live or be in that city. And the Russians covered it up, said it was due to eating infected meat, and eventually local doctors hid the slides that revealed that this was anthrax and unlikely to have been due to meat. It was due to an airborne infection. And Matthew Meselson at Harvard showed that all the deaths appeared in a straight line, which is the direction the air flowed away from this anthrax factory. This was some U.S. research published in the Tampa Bay Times in 1990. Insects may be the new weapon in the drug war to control coca crops in other countries. Clearly, unless the government of another country allowed the United States to spray insect pests on their coca crops, this would be considered an act of biological warfare. And this article from 1993 in a book called Coca Biological Control Issues talked about how this is a list of the various pests that can damage coca crops, and down below how they may be enhanced to do a better job of destroying the crop. I thought I would look back and see when Ralph Baric started to work on coronaviruses, because it was hard for me to understand why anyone would work on coronaviruses before 2002. Why would tax money go to pay for that research? In 2002, we had the first outbreak of SARS. It's now called SARS-1. It affected about 8,000 people. About 800 people died, and then it disappeared. But it was considered a potential biological warfare agent, and there was a lot of research done after 2002 on it. However, here Ralph Baric, he was maybe even a student at that time in 1983, was publishing on this mouse hepatitis virus, which is a coronavirus. And at that time, the public and doctors only knew that coronaviruses caused colds. We were not aware that they caused any more serious illness in human beings. And really, why the NIH and the National Science Foundation would be paying to study viruses that cause colds is a question. But by 1998, Ralph Baric was still working on this coronavirus, same one. But now, who is he working with? He's working with Lisa Hensley, who was at Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Warfare Center, which was converted to be the Army's Biological Defense Center after Nixon made his proclamation. And what are they doing? They're looking at interspecies transfers, which we now know are being called, what are they being called? Think about it. Come on. Well, it's called, jumping species is one thing. It's called. What else? You see, they don't want to use these terms. They want to make up new terms. So, in any event, I actually can't remember the name now, but it's a very common spillover. Yes, spillover is the invented terminology so that you don't go back and look at research that talks about interspecies transfer. Interspecies transfer here obviously happens in a lab. Spillover is supposed to happen out in the wild. But how often does that happen, and how often does it happen in the lab? Also, in that slide, you can see that when they did transfer this virus among different species of experimental animals, it affected the organs that it affected the organs that became infected, and they, in some cases, the virus became more virulent, which would obviously be of interest to a biological warfare / defense Army unit. Now, jumping to 2014, the United States under Obama announced that it was going to start a big global health security agenda, that biological warfare and pandemics were not something that the United States could deal with on its own. But in fact, these things could start anywhere and then come and bite us. And so we needed to get the rest of the world up and ready for biowarfare events or pandemics. And so at this point, the United States said, we're going to pay over 40 nations to do this type of work, and we're going to help them get their biodefense measures ready. And this is going to be a big deal. And the United States started pouring billions of dollars into this. And what were they doing? Well, they wanted interoperable systems for disease detection in real time. What does that mean? A big part of that means they want your medical records, and they want them in real time because they want to see, or allegedly they want to see, whether a lot of similar syndromes suddenly pop up in a part of the world and whether this is something that needs to be immediately investigated. But what does it also mean? It also means they now have a lot of potential blackmail material if you have had an STD or you've been drinking too much or whatever. If your medical records contain what is supposed to be sacrosanct information, but according to the biohealth security agenda, the government and the WHO now need this information. This also was the beginning of talking about a whole of government approach, sort of elevating the seriousness of this biodefense, bioterrorism concern or risk to something that we all needed to be tremendously concerned about. So this is a paper published in Nature, probably the premier science journal in the world, about research that was conducted by Ralph Barrick, his graduate student, who is now a professor himself at Galveston, Vinci Menachery, and I believe Xi Zhengli was involved with this. But it was already clear that risky gain-of-function research was happening, and the world needed to be concerned. And many scientists were. And what the Obama administration did was said, okay, don't worry, we're going to put a moratorium on this work. We're going to stop it until we figure out how to do it safely. But all they did was actually stop the gain-of-function research for coronaviruses, SARS-like viruses, and for avian flu viruses, and they didn't stop gain-of-function on anything else. I'm going to be jumping into where things are going now. And before I do that, I want to just give my confirmation that which the other speakers have already said is that I think COVID, as well as the anthrax letters, were deep events, and they look very similar when you see what preceded them and what succeeded them. So each had a scripted simulation. Each was asserted, perhaps wrongly, to have originated in countries that were already being targeted by the United States. Each led to tremendous spending. Probably 150 billion to 200 billion has been spent on biodefense since the anthrax letters. And, we don't even know how much has been spent since COVID appeared. In each case, fake investigations were done, and a real investigation was thwarted. Each one led to increasing surveillance of the population. The anthrax letters and the Twin Towers and the other events of 9/11 resulted in the global war on terror, which meant we can justify a war anywhere, wherever we liked, and it could go on. And we didn't have to really explain it. We could just do it. And I don't know why the world has allowed that, but it has. And then in 2021, the biosecurity agenda has brought the low-intensity war home. And now we realize it's on everybody else, but it's also on us. So where is all this going? Let me set the stage. Why did Tony Fauci, despite all evidence to the contrary, insist that COVID had a lab origin? It wasn't only because he wanted to protect himself. There were deep agendas at play. It got his agency more money. It supported the whole biosecurity agenda, which is, based on the fact that pandemics come from spillover from animals, from wild animals, and that they don't come from labs. So if you acknowledge that COVID actually came from a lab, your whole justification for spending hundreds of billions of dollars on the biosecurity agenda falls apart. But also, they had figured out that this natural origin zoonotic spillover story could be used to support the climate change narrative, to justify this other crazy thing, which I'll get to, called the One Health agenda, and to blame overpopulation and specifically human activity for pandemics. And they were even able to figure out how it would justify censorship, because we had to censor conspiracy theories because we needed China to cooperate with us on understanding COVID. So we had to censor people who were saying anything against China. Yeah. Very well planned. So this is what Tony Fauci and his associate David Morans published in September of 2020. Quote, in a human-dominated world in which our human activities represent aggressive, damaging, and unbalanced interactions with nature, we will increasingly provoke new disease emergences. We have to think and we have to live in more creative harmony with nature. This is Tony in 2020. Here's the Telegraph, which is the Wall Street Journal of the UK, and they're quoting Dr. Daszak. We may be much more vulnerable to these pandemics than we think. We may be creating a perfect storm. This is about how do we as a species deal with what is potentially an existential threat to our existence. This is all three of these are from September of 2020. This was the narrative that was being pushed out. And the next day, Peter Daszak tweeted, "What's shocking is that we all thought this would happen, and here we are. Pandemics, hurricanes, wildfires, economic recessions, all a result of our continued and relentless abuse of the planet." All right. So you can see the narrative is really being spun. Next slide. Aha. It's the wildlife trade. World Economics, Forum. Scientists warn worse pandemics are on the way if we don't protect nature. Next slide. New York Times. The pandemic is your fault. We're not taking good care of the environment. Next slide. The Guardian. Destruction of wildlife and the climate crisis is hurting humanity. With COVID-19, a clear warning shot, say experts. And this was coming from the UN's environmental program chief. And how now they move to start spinning that pandemics are due to climate change. Climate modeling may be used to offer an early warning of future disease outbreaks. Again, Nature, the top science journal in the world. Rolling Stone, let's get the young people propagandized as well. How climate change is ushering in a new pandemic era. I have about 20 headlines like this. So this was a very powerful push to convince everybody that climate change and pandemics go hand in hand, and we must manage both if we are to survive future pandemics and if we are to survive climate change. Now I am moving over to what's going on at the WHO. So now that the scene has been set, the stage is prepared, the WHO and countries like the United States and the UK decided we had to do the claim was, this wasn't really what they wanted, but the claim was we'd done such a bad job managing the last pandemic that we had to do a much better job. And our main problem was equity. We hadn't shared our vaccines fairly with the developing nations. And so clearly we needed a new way to handle pandemics in the future since they're about to get sprung on us all the time. So what happened was the document on the left, which has been in existence since 1969, was to be massively amended. So a whole new set of regulations would be put into place. And then the document on the right would be created. It did not exist before, but the nations are going to create a pandemic. It's called a pandemic agreement now. It used to be called a treaty, accord, instrument. It's had 5 different names, but they've settled on agreement as I think a happier sounding term. And this has the meat and potatoes of how the new pandemic agenda will be managed. What do these documents actually do? So there's been about 9 versions of the treaty, and there's been about 3 versions of the amended international health regulations. So I have to show you things that are in most of the versions, but not necessarily every single draft. And we don't have a final draft of either document yet. Teams are still negotiating them as we speak. There's going to be a meeting in 9 days to begin discussing and voting on them, and yet there is no final version, which breaks the rules. Each of them, the regulations needed a final version 4 months in advance, and the treaty needed a final version 6 weeks in advance, and the WHO doesn't care if they break their own rules. All right, what was going to happen? This is what was desired. So these things were all in earlier versions enforced. Nations were required to surveil their citizens' social media presence and emails and stop the spread of misinformation or disinformation that goes against the WHO's narratives. Human rights protections were crossed out in the original version of the regulations. They had been in. The earlier version said we have to carry out these directives, with protection of human rights. That was crossed out. It's now been added back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're preserving human rights. Orders versus recommendations. So the recommendations in the IHR, which are international health regulations, were previously recommendations, but now that the negotiators have added the word shall many dozens of times in both documents, and in international treaties, that means the nations must obey. So even though they say that the WHO won't be giving orders to nations, that is not the case. It will. And it has a compliance committee to make sure that the nations comply. And it is demanding that each country have a focal point, which will investigate whether the country is in fact complying. Okay, so the WHO would have the right to tell you what drugs you must have, what drugs you're not allowed to have. Its budget would increase by about a factor of 10 or more. It required nations to be able to roll out vaccines without a license and without testing or very minimal testing. And it required in earlier versions that they roll out liability shields for such products, since what manufacturer wants to make a vaccine and roll it out with no testing if they don't have the liability protection. They wanted digital vaccine passports. Now, in the latest version, they're saying digital or paper, but they still require vaccine passports. All right. One Health is another thing that is in the treaty. I'm using the same story from a fairy tale. One Health is exactly the emperor's new clothes. It is a meaningless construct that is designed to throw everything in the world, because the world includes people, animals, plants, and ecosystems. They will all be thrown into the basket of One Health and turned over to the WHO to manage when there are emergencies in any of those areas. Here we have the so-called experts who have created the most recent One Health Joint Plan of Action, and it means nothing. Except they love water, food, energy, and biodiversity. They're going to be on top of all of that, and they're going to work together to drive change. Here, the Lancet sort of let the cat out of the bag and published an article on One Health, pointing out that it takes a fundamentally different approach to the natural world, one in which we are as concerned about the welfare of non-human animals and the environment as we are about humans. So pretty much everyone who sees that is very worried about what that really means. Are humans to be at the level of cattle? This is a list of what the One Health Commission thinks of some of the things that fall under the rubric of One Health. You can see they've thrown the kitchen sink into that list. This was just rolled out last month by the US government, and they're talking about their One Health approach. And the US government now has said, as of April last month, that they're going to pay for 100 countries to develop their global health security strategy. They're concerned about zoonotic disease spillover, biosurveillance. They want to share your information. They're big on stopping people from killing and eating wildlife or trading it. And they want to fix climate change. But this is very strange. They're now saying that health systems that contribute 5% to global warming. And so they want to change health systems so they don't do that anymore. Make of that what you will, but I wonder if part of it is telemedicine and another part is giving us many fewer tests Another thing the WHO is trying to do is create a biohub system to share biological materials with epidemic or pandemic potential. That means dangerous things that can cause pandemics, they want to actually collect in a lending library and share. This was in the June version of the treaty, and it said basically if you're doing gain of function research, you're studying transmissibility and pathogenicity of dangerous microorganisms, then do it safely, but minimize unnecessary administrative hurdles for the research. Now, what the heck does that mean? That looks like they want more accidents. This was in a later draft of the treaty. It's talking about the pathogen access and benefit sharing system. So the most dangerous viruses and bacteria and fungi are all going to go into this biohub, and they will be shared, and nations will get some money if they share them, and they are used to make drugs, vaccines, or tests by pharmaceutical companies. This was in the February 14th draft of the treaty, just 3 months ago. And what did it say? This is the only time they actually use the terminology gain of function in one of these drafts. But it told us what they were really aiming for, that the Director General of WHO would appoint a committee of scientists, and then they would supervise gain of function research with these very dangerous pathogens. So what's going on? Well, one way to look at this is can be seen in a letter that only came out on Friday, that Senator Roger Marshall wrote to the Inspector General of the Defense Department. And he said, look, the Defense Department has been funding a program that involved Peter Daszak and his colleagues, an expensive program called Predict. And it also involves Metabiota, which is Nathan Wolfe, also a shadowy figure, who apparently dated Ghislaine Maxwell for a while. He said, well, you know, we U.S. government paid for this Predict program, and you collected thousands of potential pandemic pathogens. And between 2014 and March of 2020, the military has paid more money to get all of these dangerous pathogens from the University of California, Davis, which was the prime contractor for the Predict program. And so he would like to learn more about what was coming from China to the United States, et cetera. So he's asking the DoD IG for documents. But this is very interesting. So the United States already had this program going on, you know, at least 10 years ago, to collect all of these pandemic pathogens and put them in our own Fort Detrick biohub. But now we're globalizing this program, Predict, and we want this collected pathogens from at least 31 countries that I'm aware of. But now we want all the countries to be finding and sharing their own pathogens with the program. If you share these organisms widely, you won't only have accidents, but you're going to also have trouble figuring out whether they were deliberately released or they appeared because of an accident. It means nations won't even have to bother developing their own biowarfare labs because they'll be given the weapons themselves. And because nations have also been required by the WHO in these documents to sequence the pathogens and put the sequences online, hackers can download them and obtain them as well. However, as I said, the United States was doing this for 10 years. It looks like the WHO has been doing this for 3 years. They launched a biohub with Switzerland 3 years ago to do exactly the same thing before any of the nations gave the WHO permission and said, we want you to have a lending library of potential pandemic pathogens, i.e. potential biological warfare agents. The United States is also preparing for a permanent pandemic state. It launched its pandemic office last year, and who's heading it? Of course, a retired general. And yes, some of the reason to do this is because there's a lot of money to be made from pandemics, and it is a way to give out more vaccines. it might be a way to cull the population. But I think it's bigger than that, and it has to do with trying to achieve a one world government using the UN/WHO system. So let's go back to One Health. The Lancet has a One Health Commission also. I mean, many billions of dollars have been spent to build out One Health agencies and commissions all over the world, even though it doesn't help you to do anything any better and probably worse than the way things have been done before. But what do they say? What is the ambition of the One Health Commission is to galvanize transformations in global governance. Here's the European Union. They have even though they're just the EU, they have a global health strategy. It's a changing world. So a new global health order is emerging. Global governance will require a new focus to maintain a strong and responsive multilateral system with the WHO at its core. And so the UN put out this document last year. It wants to go in the same direction as the WHO, and some people think this is a plan B, that if the WHO does not get what it wanted, which I'm sorry I didn't say it earlier, but what these WHO documents ask for is for the Director General to be able to unilaterally declare a public health emergency of international concern, and then he can roll out whatever orders he wants to deal with it. So he doesn't have to ask anybody permission to do that. And then the nations will have to go along. The UN is proposing the same thing, that the Secretary General on his own bat would be able to declare a global shock, a global emergency, and then he wants standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically. That means without the agreement of the General Assembly nations, 193 nations that are part of the UN, and he can just get an emergency platform going and tell nations what to do. This is from that same document. It's this graphic says these are the objectives of an emergency platform, and what you would expect to see is the objective is to have fewer deaths, to get supplies to the area quicker, to manage things better. But those are not the objectives at all. The objectives are to gain high-level political leadership, to use words like equity and solidarity that don't really mean much. A coherent multilateral response means run by the UN, inclusive and networked multilateralism, whatever that means. Advocacy and strategic communications, whatever that means. Securing commitments, that means money, and accountability means you get punished if you don't go along with it. So what are the objectives? What are they really looking for? It's not clear, but the Secretary General wants the same right that the Director General of the WHO wants, which is to decide when to call the emergency and then decide what to do with it. Next slide. And also like the WHO documents, which tell you how much it's going to cost and what the details are going to be later, after committees that haven't been formed yet decide, the UN is going to do the same thing. We'll tell you what this is going to be like later. Next slide. Okay, let's call this what it is. The proposed International Health Regulation Amendments, Pandemic Agreement, One Health, and the UN's emergency platform are simply legal mechanisms designed to gain jurisdiction over the nations and people of the world using the guise of public health and potential emergencies. We don't want it. We don't need it. There's no scientific or logical or medical justification to centralize control of emergencies in the hands of these agencies that have never successfully managed any emergencies before. The best thing to do is to try to delay consideration of these treaties and not vote for them at the meeting starting on May 27th. But if we can't do that, then what we need to do is vote no. The Dutch parliament has instructed its government to do that. 11 nations told the UN back in September that they were not going along. And there are several other nations whose officials have also said publicly they were not going along. Unfortunately, today there was a helicopter accident with the Prime Minister of Iran. Iran was one country that was not going along. And 5 days ago or 4 days ago, there was an attempted assassination of the Prime Minister of Slovakia, who also said his country was going to not go along with these two treaties. And he has been in serious condition. He is still alive. We think he's going to live, but he's still badly off. So those may be the consequences of trying to go against this attempt to gain maximal control over the entire world. And let's localize control over health. In the United States, 22 attorney generals have done just that. They have pointed out that the Constitution says that powers not given specifically to the federal government by the Constitution are revert to the states, and healthcare is one of those powers, and they will be managing the healthcare of their citizens in 22 states. Thank you very much. They do not need the WHO, and they will not be following the orders of the WHO. So this is what we need to do everywhere, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This whole issue is so overwhelming in terms of the scope of using biology to, biowarfare issues here as a means of power and control and so forth. And I look at that in comparison to friends of mine who basically say, just, hey, so there was a virus that got out and we have a vaccine to fix it and we're on our way. I mean, it's such a complete, utter blindness to the world that you're suggesting is really going on here. So it makes me wonder how to bring this to the attention of people who, I'm overwhelmed. How do people who haven't even looked at the COVID thing as being a scam, how do they react to this? I mean, how can we bring it to them?
Well, I think you need bite-sized pieces, right? So this was a 9/11 audience, so I threw a great deal at you. But I think showing people what Fauci said, for instance, or what Peter Daszak was doing, may be helpful. And it depends. I mean, different people are concerned about different things. I think the fact that the WHO could mandate untested vaccines on us is extraordinarily dangerous. Maybe the most dangerous thing of all, although I'm equally worried about these pandemic pathogens that are going to get out. But I think most people, and I tried to give a history of biological warfare to contextualize it so it didn't seem so far out to people. It seemed like something that really could happen, that has happened to other countries. The fact is that the guy that invented the idea of developing a vaccine in 100 days, so the two people who brought that concept to Davos were Bill Gates and Jeremy Farrar. And Jeremy Farrar was the head of the Wellcome Trust, so two of the biggest funders of medical research in the world. And that was in 2017. And they said, they founded this organization called CEPI, Coalition of Academic Innovation and Preparedness. And 100-day vaccines is their plan. Design them in 100 days and manufacture them in 30 more days and get them to everybody in the country by then. And there's no time to test them in humans with that schedule. But Jeremy Farrar was moved from the Wellcome Trust to the WHO to roll this program out on us and to bring forth these WHO documents, because he's funded developing nations' health systems in the past. And so he has power, he has the connections to try to bring countries into the tent. And so he took a huge drop in salary to go from director of the Wellcome Trust to be the chief scientist of the WHO. And he's there to do this to us. So it's not a fantasy that they're going to roll out vaccines, in 130 days. It's very real, and they're going to be untested, and you're not going to be able to sue anybody if they kill you or injure you. So that may be a stepping stone to helping people explain the enormity of what's happening.
I did a little video. I mean, this is my own little thing. The reason I didn't take the vaccine before I knew anything about the vaccine was the idea that if you have something like a medication that has, say, 99.9% safe and then a 0.1%, will kill you, that might be justified if it's going to be given to the people who are sick. But if you give it to the whole population, 0.1% of the population of the United States is 300,000 people. So if you have a disease that might kill 10,000 people, and here's this vaccine with this 0.1% chance it'll kill you, you're talking about killing 300,000 people to potentially save 10,000. I mean, the math of it just doesn't make sense. And the idea that
Well,
vaccines
the
can save
centralization
testing
doesn't
is
make
insane.
sense. Let me interrupt
What?
you.
Yeah.
So if you're practicing medicine, you can't, Tedros isn't even a physician. He's got a PhD. If you're practicing medicine, you've got one patient in front of you and you do a risk benefit calculation for that patient. You don't subject that patient to more risk than benefit. And so to have, the WHO tell everybody in the world they have to take something and nobody does the risk benefit calculation, is basically criminal. It goes against everything in public health. So sorry, I wanted to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying the standards for something to address a specific issue, that's one thing. Something you're going to give to the whole population, whether you need it or not, is on such a different, I mean, the idea of that is such a different scale. I don't think people get the picture. Anyway, I should give up the floor and let some of the other people ask questions to you or Madhava or both or whatever. So whoever is running this show, go for it.